My name is Vanessa. I'm 40 years old. I've been married to Smith for 15 years. We have 2 beautiful children, a home in a quiet neighborhood, and a life that looks perfect from the outside. But what I'm about to share isn't perfect. It's the truth, as messy and painful as it is. Smith is a good man. He works hard, provides for us, and loves our family. But over the years, something changed between us. It wasn't sudden. It was slow, like a drift I didn't notice at first. We stopped talking the way we used to. The laughter, the connection, it all faded under the weight of work, kids, and life. I felt invisible. I told myself it was normal, that every marriage goes through ups and downs. But deep down, I felt empty. Like I was just going through the motions, day after day, with no end in sight. Then Eric moved in next door. Eric was friendly, helpful. He and his wife had moved in a couple of years ago, and our kids played together often. At first, he was just the neighbor, a nice guy who'd wave from his yard or help out if something needed fixing. But over time, our conversations started to feel different. He noticed things no one else seemed to notice. I remember the first time I really noticed him, not just as a neighbor, but as something more. It was a summer afternoon, and I was outside watering the garden. He came over to ask if I needed help fixing the fence between our yards. It had been wobbly for weeks, and Smith hadn't had time to deal with it. Eric stayed longer than he needed to. We talked, laughed, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like someone was paying attention to me. At first, I thought it was harmless. Just friendly conversations, a little bit of attention I didn't even realize I was craving. But as the days went by, I found myself looking for him. Hoping he'd be outside when I was. Hoping he'd stop by. Then came the night Smith went on a work trip. He was gone for a week, and I told myself I'd use the time to focus on the kids and the house. But instead, I found myself thinking about Eric. That first night, after the kids were asleep, there was a knock at the door. It was late, and I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, there he was, standing there with his usual smile. He said he'd noticed the porch light wasn't working and offered to fix it. I let him in. It seemed innocent enough, just a neighbor being helpful. But after the light was fixed, he didn't leave. We ended up sitting in the living room, talking. It felt so easy, so natural, like we'd known each other forever. And then, he kissed me. I didn't stop him. I didn't pull away. I kissed him back. It wasn't planned. It wasn't something I'd even thought about. But in that moment, it felt right. Like something I'd been waiting for without even knowing it. The second he left, the guilt hit me like a tidal wave. I sat there in the dark, feeling like the worst person in the world. I told myself it was a mistake, that it wouldn't happen again. But the next night, he came back. And the night after that. I kept letting him in over and over until I didn't even recognize myself anymore. I loved Smith. I still do. But in those moments with Eric, I felt alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. And that feeling blinded me to everything else, my husband, my children, the life I was risking. I was trapped in a web of my own making, and I didn't know how to get out. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve it. But this is my story, and I have to live with it every single day. After that first week, I thought things might go back to normal. Smith came home from his trip, and I told myself I'd bury it. Pretend it never happened. But pretending is easier said than done. Every time Smith looked at me, every time he kissed me goodnight, I felt like I was lying. And I was. Eric didn't stop. He'd text me during the day, little things that seemed harmless on the surface, asking how I was, telling me a joke, making me smile. But underneath, there was always more. He knew how to make me feel special, like I was the only person in the world who mattered. And I let him. The first time he came over while Smith was home was a Saturday afternoon. The kids were playing outside, and Smith was in the garage working on some project. Eric knocked on the door, acting as casual as ever. I let him in, and we stood in the kitchen, talking quietly, our voices barely above whispers. The tension was unbearable. And yet, I didn't ask him to leave. He reached out, brushed his hand against mine, and for a moment, I thought Smith might walk in. But the thrill of it, the danger, it drowned out everything else. I felt like I was playing with fire, and I didn't care. I don't know why I didn't stop it then. I had every reason to. But instead, I found ways to keep seeing him. When Smith was at work, when the kids were at school, every opportunity became another chance. It was like I was addicted to the way he made me feel. And the worst part? I knew it couldn't last. There was one day that changed everything. It was late in the afternoon, and Eric had come over again. The kids were at a friend's house, and Smith was still at work. We were in my bedroom, and for a brief moment, I forgot about the rest of the world. But then I heard a car door slam. It was Smith. He'd come home early, something about finishing work early for a surprise dinner. Panic set in. Eric grabbed his things and slipped out the back door just in time. I remember standing there, my heart pounding so loud I thought Smith might hear it. When Smith walked into the house, he kissed me like nothing was wrong. He asked how my day was, completely unaware of what had just happened. And I smiled, pretending everything was fine. But inside, I was falling apart. That night, I lay in bed next to him, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. I couldn't keep living like this, lying to him, lying to myself. I knew I had to end it with Eric. But when I tried, I couldn't. He didn't want to stop, and neither did I. We were caught in something we couldn't control, and it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. Every time I looked at Smith, I wondered if he knew. If he could see it in my eyes, in the way I avoided his touch. The guilt was eating me alive, but the pull to Eric was stronger than anything I'd ever felt. I didn't know how to let go. I wish I could tell you I stopped before it was too late. That I did the right thing. But I didn't. I kept going, kept lying, until the lies became too big to hide. I didn't just betray Smith. I betrayed myself. And the worst part? I still didn't know how to stop. It was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. Living like that, juggling two lives, it's impossible to keep up forever. I knew it. Eric knew it. But neither of us stopped. We just kept going, pretending we could keep it hidden, pretending it wouldn't catch up with us. There was one day, it was a Friday. Smith was working late, the kids were at a school event, and Eric came over again. We didn't even talk much anymore. It was like we'd fallen into this pattern, this routine, where we both knew what was going to happen. And it did. But this time, we didn't realize my daughter had forgotten something at home. She came back early with a neighbor who was dropping her off, and I didn't hear the car pull up. Eric and I were in the living room when the front door opened. My daughter's voice rang out, calling for me, and in that moment, I thought my heart would stop. Eric bolted out the back door, and I ran to greet her, trying to act normal. She didn't see him, thank God, but the fear, the absolute terror that she might have, it shook me. I couldn't keep doing this. I couldn't risk my kids finding out. They're my world, and I was risking everything for something I couldn't even explain. That night, I texted Eric and told him it was over. I said I couldn't do it anymore, that we had to stop. He didn't take it well. He said he loved me, that he couldn't imagine his life without me. And for a moment, I hesitated. I thought about taking it all back, letting him in again. But then I thought about my daughter's face, about what could have happened if she'd seen him. And I stood firm. For a while, I thought that would be the end of it. I ignored his texts, his calls. I tried to focus on Smith, on my kids, on repairing the life I nearly destroyed. But it wasn't that simple. The guilt didn't go away. It stayed, like a shadow following me everywhere I went. I started to notice things. Smith would ask me questions, simple ones, like how my day had been or if I'd seen the neighbors lately. And I couldn't tell if he was just being his usual self or if he knew. Every word felt like a test, and I was failing. I started avoiding him, staying busy with the kids, with chores, anything to keep from being alone with him for too long. Eric didn't make it easy either. He'd show up unannounced, finding excuses to talk to me when Smith wasn't around. He'd send me long messages, begging me to reconsider. I felt trapped. I'd ended things, but it didn't feel over. And I didn't know how to make it stop. One evening, Smith came home early. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up, and my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a message from Eric. I didn't think much of it, I'd been ignoring him for weeks. But Smith picked up my phone before I could stop him. He saw the message. I'll never forget the look on his face when he turned to me. He didn't yell. He didn't get angry. He just looked at me and said, "What's going on, Vanessa?" And in that moment, I knew I couldn't lie anymore. I couldn't keep pretending. So I told him everything. I told him about Eric, about the texts, the nights he came over, all of it. I don't know what I expected. Maybe anger, maybe screaming. But all Smith did was sit down at the table and put his head in his hands. He didn't say a word for what felt like hours. When he finally looked at me, he just asked, "Why?" And I didn't have an answer. I still don't. All I could say was that I was sorry, that I never meant for any of this to happen. But the damage was done. That night, he slept in the guest room. The kids didn't understand why, and I didn't know how to explain it to them. All I knew was that everything I'd worked so hard to build was crumbling, and it was my fault. I thought telling the truth would set me free, but all it did was show me how far I'd fallen. And I didn't know if I could ever climb back. After that night, everything changed. Smith didn't yell. He didn't accuse me of anything. He didn't even argue. He just shut down. He barely spoke to me, and when he did, his words were short, distant. He started sleeping in the guest room every night, and I could feel the distance between us growing wider with every passing day. I tried to talk to him, to explain, to apologize, but he wouldn't let me. Every time I tried, he'd just say, "Not now." And the truth is, I didn't know what I could say to make it better. What words could possibly fix what I'd broken? The kids started noticing. They'd ask why Daddy wasn't sleeping in the same room anymore, why he seemed so quiet all the time. I didn't know how to answer them, so I made excuses. I told them Daddy was stressed from work, that he just needed some space. But even they could sense that something wasn't right. Eric didn't make things any easier. Even after I told him it was over, he kept trying to contact me. Texts, calls, even showing up outside my house when Smith wasn't home. He'd tell me he missed me, that he loved me, that we could figure it out somehow. But I was done. I couldn't let it go on any longer. One day, I finally told Eric to stop. I told him I couldn't see him anymore, that he had to leave me and my family alone. He didn't take it well. He said things I don't want to repeat, hurtful things. But I didn't back down. I had already destroyed so much, I couldn't let it get worse. Smith eventually found out that Eric had been contacting me. He saw the messages on my phone, the ones I hadn't deleted yet. That was the first time I saw real anger in him. He looked at me and said, "Are you still in love with him?" I didn't know how to answer. I wanted to scream that I wasn't, that I loved him, but the words got stuck in my throat. He packed a bag that night. He said he needed time to think, to figure out what he wanted. He kissed the kids goodbye and told them he'd be back soon, but he didn't say anything to me. He just walked out the door, and I stood there, frozen, not knowing if he was ever coming back. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I tried to keep it together for the kids, but every night, after they went to bed, I would sit in the living room, staring at the door, hoping Smith would walk back through it. But he didn't. I started seeing a therapist. I didn't know what else to do. I needed to figure out why I'd done what I did, why I had risked everything for something that, in the end, meant nothing. The therapist helped me see things I hadn't wanted to face, my loneliness, my insecurities, the cracks in my marriage that I had ignored for years. It wasn't an excuse for what I did, but it was the start of understanding. Smith came back after 2 weeks. He said he wasn't ready to forgive me, but he wanted to try for the kids, if nothing else. It wasn't easy. The first few weeks were tense. Every conversation felt like walking on eggshells, and I could feel his distress every time he looked at me. But I didn't give up. I started writing him letters. Every night, after he went to bed, I would write down everything I couldn't say out loud. Apologies, explanations, promises to do better. I left them on his nightstand, not knowing if he'd read them. But one morning, I found one of them on the kitchen table with a single word written at the bottom: "Thanks." It was a small step, but it was something. Slowly, we started talking again. Not about what happened, not yet, but about the kids, about work, about life. It was awkward at first, but it felt like a bridge we were trying to rebuild, one piece at a time. I don't know if Smith will ever forgive me completely. I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself. But for now, we're trying. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough.